Hey, everybody, welcome. Hope you're having a great weekend. As you can see, I have my good friend Tim Durling from Tim's Vinyl Confessions with me today. And we are here to talk about our top 10 debut albums, or at least 10 debut albums that we consider to be perfect from start to finish. Tim, of course, has been a guest on my channel before, and I've done some work with Tim's channel. So, Tim, welcome.
Hey, Jeff. I don't know what the weather's like where you are, but here it is as cold as it's been all winter and very, very windy. So, hope you're able to keep warm.
Yeah, we're in the teens here. I don't know if we're gonna climb above 20 degrees today, but yeah, it's a nice day to kind of stay inside and do a video like this, I guess. But Tim, before we start on our list, just real quickly, we talked before about your book that you have that's published now, and I know you're getting copies out to everybody. If somebody still wants to order that book, how would they get a copy of that?
Well, unfortunately, they were print to order, and the short answer is there isn't a way right now because they were print to order, but I believe that when the final order comes through, they're still being printed now. We're hoping to receive them within the next couple of weeks to send them out. But I'm hoping that we did order some spares in case like a corner got crimped on one, or so hopefully everything arrives. And once we process everybody's order, there might be 2 or 3 left, but I can't count on that. The only other thing I would say is that there is a possibility that I may do another run of soft covers. So, but when that happens, I'll let everyone know how they can get it. It's gratifying. That's probably about the 5th time someone's asked me after the Kickstarter ended about ordering one. And we actually did take quite a few late orders in just through PayPal, but at a certain point we had to get the order in to get the books printed that people had ordered. So fingers crossed I can do another run of them.
Yeah, that'd be great. When I get my copy, I'll definitely devote an episode to that, and maybe you can join me for that one. But great. All right, well, we're going to get into our list, and we're going to start with our number 10. And Tim, do you want to talk a little bit about how you came up with your list? What was the criteria you used to determine how you developed your top 10?
Sure. Well, we had a couple episodes of Tim's Vinyl Confessions that Matt Phillips and I did, where one was devoted to our top 10 debuts from the 70s and our top 10 debuts from the 80s, which for me is the majority of the music in my collection. But for this one, I wanted to go outside of that and pick 10 other debut albums that I think are really good and deserve a shout out. And in some cases, these are some albums that I've talked about rarely, if at all. So that's how I came across this 10, and I more or less rated them from 10 to 1.
Okay. All right, well, let's start with your number 10. What's your 10 pick?
Okay, well, this is a band I know you like, and Matt, big fan of. Debut album from INXS. This is from 1980. Originally, it came out in Australia. It wasn't released domestically, I don't think, until 1984. But this was issued on Atco Records worldwide. Kind of an interesting cover there. So this album, if you were to listen to it now, and you were only familiar with INXS, say from Listen Like Thieves onward, you might not immediately recognize it as INXS. It's the same band. It's Michael Hutchence. His voice he hadn't quite gotten into the cool frontman status. Although once you listen, oh yeah, that's definitely him. But what I like about this album is, like a lot of debut albums, there's a little quirkiness about it and a little bit of not naivete, but these were young guys. Like they were all like early 20s when this came out. Like they were just young and hungry, and they hadn't quite coalesced into the recognizable INXS sound, but they still managed to play really, really well together. And there are some cool songs on here. My favorite of the early INXS, it was a hit single for them in Australia, is the song "Just Keep Walking." I really like that song. I like "Wishy Washy," "Learn to Smile." Yeah, there's some cool stuff on here. Production, it's for a debut album on what I imagine was a pretty small budget. It doesn't sound that bad. It's produced by someone named Duncan McGuire, not a name I recognize. But yeah, not an album anyone ever talks about. And I just thought I'd shed a little light on the debut In Excess album.
Yeah, I think some people probably thought their debut was Shabu Shabba just because that had their big hit, The One Thing,
Yeah.
and they were on MTV. And people didn't realize that they have that album and then their second album, Underneath the Colors, which I think is also a great album. But yeah, no, that one doesn't have a song like Roller Skating or something.
Roller Skating, Newsreel Babies, On a Bus. Yeah, it's In Vain. That's a good one too. Jumping. There's one that's just called Jumping.
Yeah. So they definitely evolved over the course of the next three albums to obviously not only their sound, but also the kind of material that they were covering, the subject matter. But yeah, great pick. And I do love NXS. I've only got that on cassette. I've never found it on
Same
vinyl.
here. It's not easy to find.
Yeah, no, it's not. I think because so few copies were sold, and it wasn't obviously one that was big in circulation, at least around here. So, all right, the list that I went with was I just went with my favorite albums, debut albums that I feel were flawless from start to finish. There's not a bad track on any of them. That was kind of the only criteria that I used. It was a little harder to rank them because I love so many of them equally. But the first record that I am going to show my pick is, and I'm going to show it on a couple different formats here, but I'm going with Dire Straits' debut album. I've got a couple of cassette copies, thanks to you. This is the American version that I've got, which is on Warner Brothers. And then you got me this copy. This is a Canadian copy on Mercury Records of the debut. And then I've got a remastered CD version of this. But Sultans of Swing is the song that was played a lot on classic rock radio. It actually got to number 4 on the Billboard charts. The album itself was number 2 in the United States, and it got to number 5 in the UK. The producer was Muff Winwood, who is actually the brother of Steve Winwood from Traffic and the Spencer Davis Group. And actually, Muff Winwood was also in the Spencer Davis Group with Steve Winwood, which I did not realize. But yeah, just a fantastic album from start to finish. And actually, they got their name Dire Straits because there were 3 of them living in this tiny apartment. They had no money. They could barely afford a demo tape. So they were strapped financially. But they did get a demo out and they were able to get a recording contract. But you've got Mark and David Knopfler, who were the brothers, who would only last together for 2 albums before David left. I'm sure we've heard that story before, other siblings in rock and roll who couldn't quite work together. But, you know, aside from Sultans of Swing, Down to the Waterline is a great debut track. Six Blade Knife is a great bluesy rocker. But it's all about, you can hear Mark Knopfler and how he definitely took his vocals kind of from the Bob Dylan school of singing, but just such a unique guitar tone, such a gifted guitarist. And this debut is just a brilliant showcase for what a great band they were and the talents of Mark Knopfler.
Isn't that strange how, like, I always find that strange when bands are on different labels in different parts of the world. You know, it's like in Rush in Canada were on Anthem Records, their own label, really. And then most of the world, they were on Mercury. And you can even find some of their albums in Japan on Atlantic, old albums like Farewell to Kings. Yeah. Yeah, I remember that. I remember when, if you recall, I mean, everybody's seen the Money for Nothing video, but there's a part where it actually shows the Money for Nothing label about halfway through the video. And if you look really close, where the record label would be, it says Warner Graham Records. And it was years later that I said, oh, I know why they did that. That's to cover worldwide. They could release one version of the video.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
yeah, interesting.
So the next one I have is a relatively new one. It came out about 6 years ago. It's one of just a handful of newer bands that I've really gotten into and have followed them, although I don't have their most recent album. This is the debut album from Inglorious, UK band, very much in the vein of Whitesnake, maybe more modern, Deep Purple sounding. There's like organ in the band. And fantastic lead singer named Nathan James. They're on Frontiers Records. They've done some big touring over in the UK, not so much on these shores, but if you're a fan of Whitesnake, like commercial era Whitesnake, I highly recommend checking this band out. And I don't know, it's probably either between this album or maybe the second one, which is just called Inglorious 2, that are my favorites. But yeah, this is a killer hard rock album. Kind of sounds timeless. Doesn't really sound of its time. Doesn't really sound any time. But I wanted to give this a shout out to shout out the band, and a really good debut album.
Cool, interesting. I think I've heard of them, but I didn't know like what style of music or how many albums they had or anything like that. But very cool. My number 9 is going to be the complete opposite end of the spectrum, and I am going to go with the debut album by the band Music from Big Pink. You've got the cover, which was designed by Bob Dylan. Of course, the band were previously known as the Hawks, and they toured with Bob Dylan in 1966 when he was kind of going electric. It was recorded in New York and Los Angeles. People think the album was recorded at Big Pink, which was a house that they rented in Woodstock, in the basement of Big Pink, but that's not actually true. That's where the songs were written and developed, but it was actually recorded in New York and LA. It was produced by John Simon, who had done some work with Big Brother and the Holding Company, Janis Joplin's early band, and also Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And he'd been recommended by their manager, Albert Grossman, who was also Bob Dylan's manager. But the big single off of here, the big hit off of here was The Weight, which appeared in the Easy Rider movie. It reached number 63 in the US, which not a huge hit. You hit number 63, but for a debut single, I guess. In Canada, it hit number 35, and in the UK, it got as far as number 21. The album itself was number 30 in US, but more than its chart success, it was really responsible for influencing a lot of like the roots rock or Americana that kind of came after it. Eric Clapton almost lost his religion over it because he had been very much a blues, very flashy guitarist, and he heard that album and he totally went in a different direction, beginning with his solo work. Cream broke up shortly after that, and he was very heavily influenced by the band, as was George Harrison from the Beatles, very much influenced. But, the band were largely a Canadian band. It was only Levon Helm, the drummer, who was not from Canada. And so I think that explains why the chart success was a bit higher in Canada than it was in the US. But Robbie Robertson wrote or co-wrote much of the songs. Richard Manuel and Bob Dylan were doing some songwriting together. But it's just a great album from start to finish. And it definitely was in keeping with a lot of rock and roll at the time, which was moving away from the psychedelic rock that had dominated 1967. The Beatles had come out with the White Album. The Rolling Stones had come out with Beggar's Banquet, which was a return to form. And the band was very much kind of keeping. It was a perfect album to release at that time, where everyone was kind of dialing it back from kind of the excesses of the psychedelic rock era. But yeah, I'm going to go with that one for my number 9.
It's crazy too that the Weight didn't chart higher, because everybody knows that song. It's just sometimes chart positions don't reflect a song's popularity.
Yeah.
So my number 9 is number 8, I guess. My number 8 goes back to 1983, and an album that wasn't released in North America until 1989, once this band became bigger. It's a debut album from Europe. And originally this was released with just a band shot, sort of like the same photo session. They were a 4-piece at this band. They were also a lot heavier than what people might expect. Very Euro metal sounding, very sort of, if you think of early Yngwie Malmsteen or what's another comparison? Not quite like Maiden and Priest levels, but definitely not the Europe of the Final Countdown or Out of This World. Same basic lineup. You still had Joey Tempest on vocals and John Norum on guitar. And they, again, like INXS, these guys were really young when this came up, but it's very, very professional. For a debut album, just on a Swedish label, it doesn't sound bad. It's a pretty good sounding album, but I think people would be pleasantly surprised what, like, if you're into that sort of Euro metal sound, to check this album out and go, wow, that's really good. But yeah, this didn't come out. I remember getting this on cassette in 1989 and being very surprised to see it in the stores, because I knew that the Final Countdown was actually their third album. I found a cassette for the second album, Wings of Tomorrow, which did come out in the States, but this one was eluding me, and then they reissued it. So it's not the easiest thing to find these days, but a very good debut album, and it might change people's perception of what this band actually sounds like. I would recommend checking this out.
Yeah, I know when the Final Countdown came out, I really thought, like I'm sure many people did at the time when they saw it on MTV, oh, this is a new band, and the Final Countdown is their debut album.
So did I.
So, yeah, it's not. And also, if all you've ever heard from Europe is the Final Countdown, I think you would be pleasantly surprised that that really doesn't characterize very accurately a lot of their sound, because they're still putting albums out today, and it's heavy albums, the heavy music.
Their last album, the albums that they started with in 2004, and they've put out, I think, 5 albums. That it's been almost 5 years since their last one. They've all been really good, and they've all been really, really solidly heavy all the way through.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, my number 8, and I know this was on your 70s list, but I'm including it as number 8 on mine. I'm going to go with the debut from Kiss. It was released on February 4th, 1974. It was recorded in Bell Sound Studio in New York. The producers were Kenny Kerner and Richie Wise. This has got Kissin' Time on it, but that was not on the original release of the album. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like busting right out of the gate with what is an iconic album, and what some people still think, considering Kiss's extensive catalog, a lot of people still think this is the best album that they ever put out. And this still has a number of songs that are prominent in their live act, even to this day. Some people think some of the versions are better on the original Alive album. They kind of made the Alive version sort of the official in many people's minds, but I still think this is a solid debut. Strutter is a fantastic track. Cold Gin, a song that was written by Ace Frehley, but Gene Simmons actually sings. Ironic, considering Gene Simmons doesn't drink.
Exactly. Yeah.
A song that was actually originally, and I forget which track it was. There was a track on here, I think it might have been Strutter, but it was actually in the days of Wicked Lester. It was called Stanley the Parrot.
I think you're right. Yeah. Thank goodness things turned out the way they did, because we wouldn't be talking about Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons today.
Right.
If they'd have had some of the original titles, original arrangements of some of those. Anyone who's never heard those Wicked Lester demos, they don't sound like Kiss at all.
Right. Well, and I was reading too that Warner Brothers actually they canceled their contract with Casablanca Records over Kiss's makeup, because they were like, they got to take that makeup off. We're not signing a band that looks like that. And Bill Aucoin, their manager, stood his ground. He said they're not taking their makeup off. This is who they are. And Casablanca stood behind the band, and they terminated their relationship with Warner Brothers Records over it. But I think obviously Kiss have stood the test of time, and I can't imagine them, being as successful any other way. But
yeah, can you imagine if the debut album looked like Lick It Up and just 4 guys? The songs are great, and you can't argue with the songs. You're right. Even though, live, they did kind of, pun intended, come alive. But yeah, Deuce, Black Diamond, 100,000 Years. It's surprising, when you just get into the band, how many of those classic staples of their live set to this day all came from that first album. And you mentioned Warner Brothers. Those are some of the hardest copies of the first Kiss album to find, the ones that have the Warner distribution, because that did not last long.
Yeah, Black Diamond is my favorite. I think my favorite Kiss song. probably of their entire catalog, but it's just, I mean, I mean, I don't want to say hit after hit, but
Yeah.
just classic track after classic track. And I mean, I suppose if there was one track, you know, that would maybe less than the others, it might be, you know, Love Theme from Kiss, but I still like that track. I think, you know, it's one of the few instrumentals that
I like it. Yeah, I like it because it's one of those. Yeah, basically what there's that and Escape from the Island on the Elder, and if you count the car jam on Revenge, yeah, there aren't a lot of Kiss instrumentals. And I like Love Theme from Kiss, and I think Pearl Jam liked it too because when they did it live, it sounds an awful lot like Love Theme from Kiss.
yeah.
Well,
Well, we
I
might
mean,
be, we might be,
we
getting to a
know
little
they
bit.
liked it, right? We know they liked it. You know,
Sure.
definitely Mike Brady did. So
Yeah, well, a lot of bands. I mean, so many bands were influenced by that debut album. But yeah, timeless for sure. So you're number 7?
yeah, number 7, another band. You know, when the pantheon of American hard rock bands, these guys have been called America's greatest rock and roll band, and there are very few, I think, that would come close to that status. It's the debut from Aerosmith, 1973. Now, there's 2 covers of this that are similar, and this, I believe, was the first one that came out. They didn't have their logo yet. They had the Wings idea, but it didn't quite come together just yet. Of course, this was reissued in 1976 when Dream On actually became a hit. And so this picture was enlarged, took up more of the cover, and it actually says featuring the hit Dream On. I'm guessing Jeff's going to get that copy of it. That's what actually my CD looks like. There you go. Yeah. It's funny because it's strange to me, and I just thought of this now, that when they reissued it, they didn't use the Aerosmith logo because they had it by then, I think. But this is a great debut album. This first album was not produced by Jack Douglas. It was produced by a guy named Adrian Barber. The production's not great on it, but kind of like the Kiss album, it's hard to argue with the songs. Obviously, Dream On, we've all heard Dream On a million times. I still think it's an amazing song. You've got Mama Kin, which a lot of people my age knew because Guns N' Roses does it on GNR Lies. But there's Make It is a good heavy one that opens the album. Walking the Dog, which is spelled Walking the Dig on the back of this album for some reason. That was the Rufus Thomas cover, which 10 years later, a band that Aerosmith heavily influenced, Rat, did an awesome version on their debut EP. Moving Out, first song Steve Tyler and Joe Perry ever wrote together. It's basically it's Steven Tyler's stream of consciousness lyrics. No, we all live on the edge of town. Where we all live ain't a soul around. Like that's about like 1325 Commonwealth is the address they lived in Boston. One Way Street's a great bluesy shuffle. This album wasn't big when it first came out. As a matter of fact, it just celebrated an anniversary. I think it came out January 5th, 1973. But amazingly, against all odds and drugs and fighting, it's still these same 5 guys that are Aerosmith to this day. And but this is a fine start to a career. Now, the only thing about this album, if the only thing you've heard on this is Dream On, when you start listening to the other tracks, one thing you will notice, and I certainly noticed it when I was getting into their back catalog, Steven Tyler sounds a little different on this album. His vocals sound a little bit different. Apparently, he was really nervous when that red recording light would come on. Not the first time he was in a studio, but it was a big deal. They had a big contract with Columbia Records. So don't let that throw you. It's Aerosmith through and through. Joe Perry, Brad Whitford, the interweaving guitars. They played really well together right from the start. The rhythm section of Tom Hamilton and Joey Kramer, rock solid. And a fine debut album that changed everything.
Yeah, when you talk about, the vocals on that, Steven Tyler's vocals, I remember I had the greatest hits. First Aerosmith album I ever owned was I had the greatest hits on cassette. And I remember thinking, listening to Dream On, like, who's that singing? Like, they must have had a different singer on that track, because it doesn't sound like any of the other tracks on the greatest hits, or, for that matter, even on Get Your Wings. But yeah, and Walking the Dog actually was also on the Rolling Stones debut album, their very first album. So it's a song that's been well covered.
I bet you that had a lot to do with Aerosmith doing it, the fact that the Stones did it. Except for the end of Dream On. When you get to the end of Dream On, it's like, okay, that's got to be Steven Tyler.
Yeah.
But you're right. what a difference in 1 year between the first album and Get Your Wings. As soon as, the vocal in Same Old Song and Dance comes on, you're like, well, that's Steven Tyler, even if you've never heard the song before. He sounds like himself.
Yeah, he's got his confidence, and he never looked back.
Yeah.
All right, well, my number 7, this is maybe the first album that I owned as a young kid. Not the first album I bought. It was an album that I think an uncle had given to me, and I played this to death. But it's Boston's debut album. This album was released on August 25th of 1976, recorded in 3 separate studios. It was recorded at Foxglove Studios in Massachusetts, Capitol Studios in Hollywood, and Record Plant in Los Angeles. The producer was John Boylan, who had done Linda Ronstadt and Pure Prairie League, not exactly 2 heavy rock acts that you would associate with a producer who produced this album. But Tom Schultz also was co-producer on this album. And as you know, he's very meticulous. That's why it takes so long to get a new Boston album. I've got 2 CD versions of it. This is the original CBS release, and then this is the remastered version. I'm not sure exactly when this one came out, but the sound on it is fantastic. But yeah, I mean, this, from More Than a Feeling, which the chorus of that, Nirvana borrowed that lick for Smells Like Teen Spirit. Peace of Mind, Foreplay, Long Time, one of my favorite Boston songs of all time. I just love kind of that celestial organ and the all of it. And then it just kicks in with that guitar riff, and then, Long Time, just a great track. Yeah, Rock and Roll Band. I mean, every single track on here. I mean, this reads like a greatest hits. This could be Boston's greatest hits, because every track on here is flawless. It was actually, it sold 17 million copies in the United States and 20 million worldwide. So there's very few households at one time that did not have a copy of that album, just because it was everywhere. It was on the radio. Anybody who is starting a vinyl collection usually has that album as part of their library. But again, Boston, tragically, Mark Delp, the lead singer, committed suicide. It was about 10 years ago.
7, I think it was.
Yeah. But he was such a great vocalist. Can't imagine anyone else being the voice in Boston.
The harmonies, like not just his main lines, but when you consider the harmonies are even higher than the melody, he could just do it. Like it didn't even look like it. He broke a sweat doing it.
Brad Delp, not Mark Delp.
And he's one of those singers, like I've said before, like everybody knows his voice, not everybody knows his name, which is kind of a shame. Yeah, you know what? If you all 8 of the songs on the debut get classic rock radio play, which is almost unheard of, where there were 3 top 40 hits, but all 8 songs at one time or another I've heard on the radio. One of my favorites over the years has turned out to be Hitch a Ride. I love that song. And really, honestly, if you stuck Don't Look Back, the song at the end of the first Boston album, that's pretty much all the Boston you need.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. An album that's deserving of that classic status. And, since we've started talking, someone else probably picked up another copy of it. So, and some of the best album art. It's just so cool all around.
Yeah, because there's many people, and I was one of them, who didn't know, like, that's actually a guitar. It's not just, it's a spaceship, but people, it took them a while to realize, oh, those are like,
it's a Les Paul.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think Boston got right that some 70s bands didn't is that they knew enough not to put themselves on the cover. They put a cool visual, and that stood the test of time way better. Because a lot of the albums, I mean, even like I think of Journey's next album, they hadn't gotten into the cool Stanley Mouse graphics yet, and they really should have.
Well, and it's funny too, because the liner notes on that album are straight out of like 1964. It's funny because you don't see that, like, for 1976, that you've got liner notes that read like. Yeah,
it's funny you mentioned that, because there's liner notes on the back of this Aerosmith album too. Yeah, that turned out, that's a very 60s thing. You didn't see that moving forward, unless it was a reissue.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, you're number 6.
It's number 6. I'm going to throw some Canadian here, and a band that, aside from a few pockets around the world, was basically only known in Canada, and even then, they weren't as big as I thought they should have been. This is the debut album for a band called Harem Scarum, and these guys, I think, were a victim of time in that this came out in summer of 1991, when their brand of melodic hard rock was very much out of fashion. I think if this had come out in 86 or 87, they may have been able to get more of a foothold. This album might have gone gold in Canada. I'm not sure. But if if you like Def Leppard, if you like Hagar era Van Halen, if you that sort of melodic, maybe Whitesnake, melodic hard rock, great vocalist in Harry Hess, who still sings great today. This album has one drawback, and that's the fact that it's a drum machine. I don't think there's real drums on any of these tracks, but the songs are there. Great harmonies, great guitar playing for Pete Lesperance, who's like the Nuno Bettencourt, Steve Vai of Canada, but more like Nuno in that he writes really melodic songs, but his guitar leads are incredible. This album is incredibly expensive on vinyl. I don't have it. It's like hundreds of dollars on Discogs. I think it only came out in Germany. And it came out on, they were on Warner Music in Canada, but they didn't sign to a big label anywhere else. They're still putting out albums. They put an album out 2 years ago. They've been on Frontiers Records for the last few. And if you like melodic hard rock, I would highly recommend checking out Harem Scarum. And if you don't start with this album, I would recommend starting out with the second one from 93 called Mood Swings.
Did they take their name from that Elvis movie?
They claim that they took it from one of the earliest Bugs Bunny cartoons, which was called Scare like H-A-R,
okay.
Which was an early Warner Brothers cartoon where Bugs didn't quite look like it was an early version of the character, but they claim that's where it came from. But yeah, I knew there was an Elvis movie with that name too.
Yeah. All right. Well, speaking of 1991 releases, this is probably one of the bands that was responsible for kind of the decline in popularity of heavy hard rock. I'm going to go.
I knew it. As soon as you said it, I knew it.
Yeah. Well,
I used to have that album. I owned that album. That's a good album.
It is very good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and the funny story that I have about this is in like late 1990 or early 91, I went into this kind of independently owned record store by my house, and they had all these, like on the counter, they would always have giveaways, like here, take these promo cassettes or CDs or whatnot. But back at that time, they had a promo copy. It was a cassette single for Alive. And they were just giving them away. They had stacks of them on the counter, and I never heard of Pearl Jam before. But on the B side, they covered the Beatles' "I've Got a Feeling," and so I thought ordinarily I wouldn't have even paid it much notice. I wouldn't have taken a copy, but I took a copy because I'm like, well, I'd love to hear, what this cover sounds like, and listen to it. And I thought, well, that was pretty cool, and heard Alive, and didn't think anything of it. I thought, well, whatever. I mean, I usually when you get those, you're kind of not giving it a whole lot of thought or listened to. And then it was like a few months later, all of a sudden, this was everywhere. I mean, you had Even Flow, Alive, Jeremy. I mean, so many classic tracks off here. I mean, it's sort of like the Boston album, where I feel like every track off here was played on alternative rock radio at one point or another, but just not a weak track. And in terms of, kind of that decline or the death, at least, of the 80s heavy metal, I think, Nirvana certainly was responsible to an extent, but Nirvana was very much heavy. They weren't so much classic rock like Pearl Jam was classic rock. I mean, Pearl Jam, I think, would have been popular, in any era. But they're definitely, like you say about Kiss, they were very much Kiss fans. They were definitely, the school of classic hard rock. but they were formed in the ashes of Mother Love Bone. Jeff Ament, Stone Gossard came from that band. And Eddie Vedder actually had to audition to be a part of the group. It wasn't like they just kind of organically came together. It was produced by Rick Parashar, who also produced albums by Alice in Chains, Blind Melon, Nickelback, and Bon Jovi. Yeah.
Oddly enough.
But
yeah, there's great guitar solos on there. Like a lot of those bands shunned guitar solos, but on that first album, it's just great rock music. Like I still really like that opening track Once. Like that's just a good rock song.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and it's songs that even today you'll hear on radio, and they still sound fresh. And I don't think Pearl Jam fans may argue with me, but I don't think Pearl Jam's done an album any better than that. It was sort of like they made their masterpiece right out of the gate, and I think they've still been trying to replicate the success of that album. I think, Versus and Vitology got close, but there's still some stinkers on those albums, I would argue. But I think 10 all the way through is just a flawless album. Like you say, you got the guitar solos, you got Eddie Vedder's songwriting and his vocals, which a number of kind of the new metal bands have been trying to, or even some of the grunge bands were trying to copy his vocal style into the 90s. But just a fantastically influential album, great classic rock album, and one of the best debuts of all time.
Yeah, and they're one of the only bands of that era that you hear their songs on classic rock radio too. Like it's almost like the classic rock radio that at some point it extended and it ends hard in 1991. And yeah, I don't think they ever bettered that. I think they got more and more eccentric and more like self-indulgent. But 10 for the most part is just a good collection of songs and well produced. It's got a really good high fidelity production. The drums sound really good on it, and I don't have a problem with that album. It's more the movement, but that album by itself was, oh my goodness, it was huge. Like it was everywhere, and you couldn't escape it, which is probably how I ended up with the company. That I probably needed one more CD. And one of the bands that felt the sting of that change of tides, but more or less with it, is the band I'm going to talk about next. But I'm going to rewind to 1980 for the debut album from Def Leppard, On Through the Night. Now, this album is sort of an outlier in their catalog. I guess you could say maybe Slang is too, but this one really doesn't sound much like anything that would follow. And I always liked this album cover. I know it's kind of silly, but they had the logo and the triangle concept right from the beginning. Although I don't know why they felt the need to have the logo here and still print the name there. I've seen them do that on cassettes because they would sometimes like take some liberties, but this is the record. So this is what they mean the front cover to look like. And maybe some of the reissues don't have this. I don't know. This is a US copy. Again, very, very young band. They'd only formed in 78, and Rick Allen on the drums, I believe, was like 16 when he recorded this. And, it's all very impressive. But this was very much part of the new wave of British heavy metal. And this album still to this day sits right in there. It's not heavy like Iron Maiden, but it is a little bit heavier than people might expect from Def Leppard. And it's not heavy like High and Dry was heavy. High and Dry was more of an AC/DC heavy. This is very, very, I'm going to say Euro again, very, very British sounding. Joe Elliott's vocals are a little deeper on this album, but they always had great harmonies right from the beginning. If you listen to the intro to Hello America, Wasted is a pretty well-known song off of this one, Rock Brigade. They're a little tad bit goth, or their version of goth with songs like When the Walls Come Tumbling Down, Answer to the Master, Overture. But for the most part, this just illustrates a band that had all kinds of potential. And I think a lot of people I certainly wasn't into them. I was 6 in 1980, but I think a lot of people said, okay, this is a band to watch. And obviously it only went up from there. It went gold, I think in 83, after Pyromania was big. And then in 1989, it eventually went platinum in the States. And I don't know where it sits now for certifications, but worth checking out, even if you think you don't like Def Leppard, if you've never gone back to this one album. I mean, the guys in Metallica will even talk about liking this album. So there you go. That's my choice.
Yeah, no, excellent pick. And it sounds like a band that was trying to find their way and figure out their identity as far as the music scene goes. But yeah, I'm sure that album had an uptick in sales after Pyromania came out, and everybody's going back through their early catalog and buying those records up. So very cool. All right, we're my number 5. And this was an album that was recorded on June, or I'm sorry, it was released on June 1st, 1970. It was actually recorded in one day in a 12-hour session on October 16th, 1969. I'm going with the debut album from Black Sabbath. And I remember seeing this cover in the store and just being totally creeped out by it. Like, what is that? Who is that woman? Is she a witch? Is she a ghost? What in the heck is going on there? But definitely a very unsettling, creepy cover, which definitely matches the music within. This is a original CD copy, and then I've got the remastered CD version as well. It actually got to number 8 in the UK and number 23 in the US, which for a band like this in 1970 just blows me away that this album got that high. For a band that was not established, a band that for all intents and purposes was creating doom metal. I mean, it's very heavy music. The title track, which describes, this person seeing apparition and this like satanic apparition, that was actually a true story. Geezer Butler got very big into the occult in the late 60s. He actually painted his bedroom black, and he had all like these occultic symbols, and he was just getting heavily into that kind of thing. And he said he woke up one night and there was this image, like this ghastly image at the foot of his bed, scared the crap out of him, kind of put him off like all of his occult enthusiasm that he had. But that first track, just with the rain and the gonging bells and just Ozzy Osbourne's lyrics, it just sounds so unsettling, so disturbing. But you've got The Wizard, which is kind of it's got harmonica on it. It's a very bluesy track. Then you've got
It's about Gandalf from Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's one of those that it's got some classics on here. It's not as big as probably the Paranoid album is, but you've got NIB, it's Nativity in Black, which is still one of their concert favorites. Wasp, Behind the Wall of Sleep is a great track. But yeah, it's for a debut album, one of the most influential, heavy hard rock albums of all time. And I think the first 6 Black Sabbath albums are really untouchable. But that one for me is still a favorite. And I think it's a remarkable debut considering it came out in 1970. I think all the more impressive.
I can't even imagine the impact that must have had, like walking into a record store and seeing that and then putting it on for the first time, because I mean, Ozzy practically acts like he's almost assuming an actor's role. And when he sings, the "What Is This" stands for, he sounds scared. Like he sounds like that's really, really happening. And I mean, they invented heavy metal. Let's face it. Heavy metal, as we know it, wouldn't exist without Sabbath.
Yeah. So had to put that one on the list, and wish I had the shirt, but this was the best I could do. So
I expect, imagine walking into a record store and seeing that.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. That was another one. I mean, some of those Sabbath covers, it's like, oh geez, Born Again, another one where it's like,
okay, so my next one, what are we on? Number 5 now, or number
4?
4. Okay, number 4. One of my favorite bands. I'm just gonna hold it up. It's the debut album from Kansas, 1974. They haven't got their cool logo yet. One of my favorite logos, but this is a larger version of this. I think there's more to it. Can be found on the Kansas State Building. This is based on John Brown, who was an abolitionist, and he kind of became their unofficial mascot.
Right.
Because if you look at the Best of Kansas, I'm assuming he's the old guy in the Left Overture album. But right from the beginning, these guys were so accomplished musically. And there are some songs on here I don't know that you would consider strictly progressive rock. Some of it's just, I don't know. They're strange. It's a strange combination because you do have some heavy guitar riffs from Kerry Livgren and Rich Williams, Steve Walsh, amazing vocalist, and Robbie Steinhardt's a good singer too. The violin player, who's sadly no longer with us. He takes lead on some songs, and some of them are really heavy, like the closing track, "Death of Mother Nature" suite. And Phil Ehart's drumming, he never gets mentioned enough as far as the great classic drummers. His drumming was always the right thing at the right time and very, very hard to mimic. And then you had the violin. So it's a strange combination. It's not exactly Southern rock, but there are, like, the second song on here, "Bringing It Back," which is actually a J.J. Cale song. Same guy that wrote "Call Me the Breeze," "Cocaine." It's kind of a Southern rocky sounding song with violin, but it's very, you get to Bellix's, or however you say that, "Journey from Maribyrnong," "Aperçu." These are very progressive tracks. Now, this album wasn't a success right out of the gate. Of course, once Left Overture and Point of No Return became big, the first three Kansas albums all went gold, including this one. But right from the beginning, it's not like they came up with an album where it had like one or two good songs on it, the rest were kind of crappy. They were very accomplished right from the get-go. I come back to this album a lot, and it doesn't get, I don't think, enough attention. So, debut Kansas.
Yeah, I think, if you've only heard "Carry On Wayward Son" or "Dust in the Wind," I think you'd be very surprised just how progressive rock Kansas's early stuff is. Particularly "Song for America" is a very prog rock kind of an album. But yeah, it seemed like their early albums, they were kind of like dabbling a little bit in boogie rock, hard rock, Southern rock, progressive rock. So you had that mixture in there, and I think they did all of it well. And I think
Probably what you have too, Jeff, is the fact that they were kind of a combination of two different bands, because there was a band called Kansas and there was a band called White Clover, and you've got Kerry Livgren writing and you've got Steve Walsh writing a lot of songs, and they came from different areas. So you probably got songs that had been around for about 4 years at this point, and they basically picked the 8 best ones to put down on tape.
Yeah. All right. My number 4. This is an album that was released on June 6th, 1978. It got to number 18 in the US. The debut album by The Cars. Incidentally, the band hate this cover photo. David Robinson designed a lot of their album covers, and he did submit a cover for this, but the record company wanted to go with this album. But, they always said they couldn't stand that smiling face that kind of would forever be immortalized on their debut album. But it was produced by Roy Thomas Baker, who did some work with Queen, also Frank Zappa, The Who, and David Bowie. But it's like a hybrid of new wave, power pop, synth rock. I mean, you've got synthesizer on here, but it's still a hard rock album. It's also a little bit new wave. You've got some electronically treated drums, which is an unusual sound. I love you've got the dual singer-songwriters in Rick Ocasek and Benjamin Orr. I love Benjamin Orr's voice, but I think, Rick Ocasek's voice perfectly suits his songs. But I love that dual interplay that they had. And it's, again, as far as classic rock radio goes, these songs are still all over the radio today. You've got "Good Times Roll," "My Best Friend's Girl," "Just What I Needed." Those are the first 3 songs off this record. That's not like the best tracks on
Just throwing them at you. Like, here, you like this one? Here, like this one? Like this one?
Yeah. Yep. "You're All I've Got Tonight," "Bye Bye Love," and then the epic "Moving in Stereo" all mixed up medley at the end. But just a great album. This is the deluxe version. It's got some demos on the second disc here, but yeah, one of the best debut albums of the 1970s. I've heard it time and time again, but it's one of those, it still sounds fresh. I could listen to it 5 times in a row and not get sick of it. But also another, heavily influential band, and they would continue to enjoy success. They were able to, they were big in the 70s, but they also carried on that success, made that transition into the early 80s. But yeah, love that record.
So my next one, so my number 3 is another debut from the 90s. This is a very, very little known band, and they didn't do a lot of albums. This is the first album from a band called Baton Rouge. It's called Shake Your Soul. It's on Atlantic Records, and Atlantic Records, probably more than any other of the major labels, have to take a little bit of the blame for the sort of, backlash against the quote unquote hair metal bands, because they signed everybody. I mean, there were so many bands that came out between like 89, 90, 91 on Atlantic Records. I remember a time when, in the mid 90s, you used to find used CDs quite cheap, and there would be, I don't even know where, like Hurricane Alice and Sons of Angels and Wild Horses and like Sleazebees, like band after band after band after band. And then so you got to figure, like, there's an A&R guy who worked for the label, assigned them all. They all had a producer assigned to them. They all had to have a promotional budget. Like, there's just no way all of these bands could have made it. There's just no way. And a lot of those bands, between them all, you might be able to pick 10 bands, take the best song on each of those albums and make one good album. But, Dee Snider once said, if a record company would say, if one is good, 100 is better. But the truth is, if one is good, one is good. Mm-hmm. So yeah. But one of the bands that came out a little bit too late that I really think could have gotten a foothold is this band Baton Rouge. You got to, again, I say Whitesnake a lot, but you got to think Whitesnake at this time period, especially because the singer of this band, a guy named Kelly Keeling, sounds a little bit like Coverdale. Great bluesy rock singer. They had a minor rock radio hit with a song called Walks Like a Woman. That was the only commercial success they ever had on this album. But this album had 2 or 3 songs that could have been radio staples. There's a couple of really good ballads. It's About Time. There Was a Time, oddly enough, both with time in the title. Young Hearts could have been a hit. Doctor, the opening song, could have been a hit. But not a very heavy album. Almost every one of these songs potentially could have been on the radio at that time. But that doesn't mean it's bad. It's just very well put together, very well produced. Who produced this album? Produced by Jack Conte. Now, Jack Conte was an early songwriting partner of John Bon Jovi. And he also worked with, I know that name from somewhere else, but it's not coming to me. Another thing about this band is that if you look in the liner notes of Alice Cooper's Hey Stupid album, a lot of the background vocals came from the Baton Rouge guys, among many, many others. And especially in the song Love's a Loaded Gun, the high harmonies in the chorus of that song are Kelly Keeling. It's very, very obvious. They would only do one other album on Atlantic called Lights Up in the Playground. That came out in 91, and then they disappeared for a few years. Eventually in 97, this album that was self-titled came out, but it's basically just Kelly Keeling and whoever and a drum machine with some unreleased songs, one of which being a version of Love's a Loaded Gun. But this is a really, really strong album. It could have been the start of a career. Again, though, 1990, a few years too late. That's my pick for number 3.
And talk about creepy album covers too.
Well, and it's weird because I mean, it's like, what were they thinking? Like, yeah, kind of unsettling. And they couldn't come up with anything better for the back cover than the same image again.
Right.
Anyway, yeah.
All right. Well, my number 3 was released on February 10th, 1978.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
The big one, Van Halen. I still maintain this is my favorite Van Halen album. I know a lot of Van Halen fans disagree, but pound for pound, every single track on here is flawless. It was produced by Ted Templeman, who up to that point had worked with the Doobie Brothers, Montrose, Van Morrison. Got number 19 on the Billboard charts. These photographs on the album cover were actually taken at the Whiskey A Go-Go in LA, where the band had played some gigs. But it only took them 3 weeks to record this, and at a price of $40,000, which seems very cheap considering how incredible this album is, how influential it was. I mean, it's no overstatement to say this was a game changer for hard rock. I mean, the instant people heard Eruption and that guitar tapping that Eddie Van Halen so successfully popularized. But you got Running with the Devil on here, I'm the One, Jamie's Crying, Ain't Talking About Love. Every single track I've heard on classic radio, because this is
one of those.
Yeah, such an iconic album. Got the cassette here, and this is the remastered CD version. But yeah, I mean, what else can be said about it that hasn't already been said? I mean,
what a great sounding album. It doesn't sound dated in the least. Like and Ted Templeman's approach was basically to record them live, and it served him so well. And you say it would like $40,000 to produce.
Yeah.
I mean, how many times did Warner Brothers recoup that? Because it's a diamond album. It sold over 10 million copies in the US. It continues to sell. And yeah, I mean, talk about a band that paved the way for the decade to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and David Lee Roth, you know, his vocals, he's not the best vocalist, but he's the best vocalist for Van Halen. I mean, obviously Sammy Hagar, but in terms of at that time, I think the fact that his voice is not technically the best rock and roll voice you've ever heard, but I think it just suits the music so perfectly. And I think it was a great marriage.
Dave has so much personality that he brings, and he owns these songs. Like Sammy Hagar is one of my favorite singers, and I came on board with Van Halen with 5150 and then went back, but only Dave can sing these songs. He owns them. His personality's all over them. If anyone's never heard it, it circulated on the internet years ago. The version of Running with the Devil that's just Dave's isolated vocals, it's perfect. And they were one of those first bands that it was heavy. Like Running with the Devil's heavy. And there's other heavy stuff, Atomic Punk. These are heavy, like metallic songs, but they never get dark because Dave's hooping and hollering, and you know, it's fun. It's not heavy. It's exciting. It's exciting music. And I haven't heard every song on that album on the radio myself, but I've heard most of them. Like I've heard Ice Cream Man on the radio. I've heard Jamie's Crying. I've heard Feel Your Love Tonight. Certainly You Really Got Me was their first top 40 single, Ain't Talking About Love. Usually it's Eruption into You Really Got Me. And probably heard Running with the Devil lately anyway. Running with the Devil seems to be the song I've heard the most. It starts with the car horn off of Alex's Corvette or whatever car it was. And another band that had like Kiss, had a big batch of songs ready to go. And I think they chose the best ones for that first album, but they mined that back catalog all the way up to their most recent album. But yeah, definitely a game changer of an album. You can't talk about it too many times. It was too important.
Yeah. All right, number two.
Number two for me, absolutely, without a doubt, my favorite band to come out in the 2000s. The Darkness and their first album, Permission to Land. Now, I first heard this band, again, my good friend Matt Phillips, I can thank him. He showed me the video for the song Get Your Hands Off My Woman. So this is 2003. They're hard rock, commercial hard rock. I mean, this was the days of Nickelback and Creed. That's the hard rock that was making commercial waves. There was nothing fun. There was nothing fun in rock music. If you wanted fun, you had to go to hip hop or country or the boy bands. Like there just wasn't any fun commercial rock music out there. Unless it was like, no offense to anybody that likes these guys, but Blink 182 or Sum 41. But a band that actually knew how to play as well as have fun, in the spirit of that classic Van Halen, I think. So the song comes on, and I'm like, yeah, this is really good. And then I hear Justin Hawkins start to sing. And I was like, whoa! And it took my ears a long time to get used to his falsetto and his crazy vocalizations. But then their biggest hit single, I Believe in a Thing Called Love, became a huge hit. A ridiculous video. They made really, really silly videos. But I actually, the only reason I have this album or got it when I did is it was a Yankee swap at my old work. And a guy that I knew, that song would always come on the PA when we were working. We'd always like air guitar to it and stuff. So he gave me this album, and I took it home, listened to it, and I like every song on it. And I followed the band ever since. Now they did 2 albums in the 2000s, like, you know, the first decade of the 2000s. Then they split. There were other side projects. They got back together in 2012, and they've been putting out albums ever since. The newest album is Motor Heart. I've listened to that I don't know how many times. Definitely my favorite album to come out in 2021. But this debut is very accomplished. Black Shuck, Growing on Me, Love Is Only a Feeling, one of the best power ballads that I'd heard in a long, long time. Great guitar playing, not only Justin, but his brother Dan Hawkins. Good harmonies. And I still think the best way to describe these guys is a cross between AC/DC and Queen. And, you know, a lot of people probably didn't pay attention after the first 2 albums because those are the first 2. They were on Atlantic. They were on a major label. Since then, they've been kind of putting out albums independently. But this, to me, this album holds up. I can't believe it's almost 20 years old. And I just had to mention it as one of my favorite debuts.
Yeah, no question. And, you know, you had said no offense to Blink 182 and Sum 41 or whatever. I don't care. Those bands blow. Much offense to those bands. But Darkness, you're right, is very much, I remember when I heard them on the radio or heard that CD for the first time thinking like, now, are they for real or are they just trying to do a parody album of hard rock, heavy metal?
Right.
I couldn't decide because, like you say, the falsetto vocals, and it's like, that's got to be a put on. Like, is he for real? But the songs are solid. The songs are not like jokey. I mean, they sell it.
This is not Steel Panther. These are not guys playing at being a rock band. Yes, they have a great sense of humor, but they take it very, very seriously. It wouldn't be as good if they didn't take it as seriously. And I got thinking about that, you know, if I'd been of an age when Queen first came out, I would have been like, what? Okay, some of this is amazing, but some of this, what is this, My Fairy King? And what is some of this stuff? It's kind of the same idea. It's like, no, this is for real. This is amazing. You will love it. It just might take you a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I'm glad because, you know, I think that's what hard rock needed at that point in time because it was starting to take itself so seriously and, you know, getting very, not very fun to listen to. So I'm glad that
I just couldn't believe that there was a song that was being played regularly on pop radio that had just fantastic melodies, fantastic guitar playing, shredding licks. Like it was like an old friend coming back to visit you, and yet they weren't old. Like, you know, they're like our age or whatever. Like they weren't, you know, these weren't a bunch of old guys that came together and formed a band. This was a new band, and unfortunately, that moment in the sun didn't last long. And sadly, there are still some bands that they were influenced by. One I'm about to talk about that didn't get it, didn't take it seriously, thought it was a joke, but it's not a joke. And like I said, yes, they have a sense of humor, but they take their songwriting very seriously. Their lyrics are really, really unique. They're utterly unique. They're very, very English. And they'll mention a lot of place names. You don't even know where they're talking about, but it doesn't matter because they're selling it to you.
Yeah. No, that's a great one. I'm glad you showed that one. The next one I'm going to show, it was so hard between this one and number 1, but I had to go with a band that Matt and I love very dearly. I'm sure you can guess who it is, but talking about the debut album by The Doors. Now, I've got this copy, which this is the mono copy, but then I've also got a stereo copy as well of this one. This was released on January 4th, 1967, so just prior to the Summer of Love. It's produced by Paul Rothchild. The Doors were originally signed to Columbia Records, but Columbia just kind of blew them off, never paired them with a producer, never got them into the studio. So they kind of parted company, and then they were assigned by Elektra Records. This album was recorded at Sunset Sound Studios, which is a bit of a tongue twister, in Hollywood. It was recorded on a four-track machine this album. Listen to this. I mean, I can't believe it was only 4 tracks, but their first single was Break On Through to the Other Side, which I think was a bit heavy for rock radio even back then. And it only got to 126 in the US on Billboard. So it tanked. But then Light My Fire hit #1 in April of 1967, and they never looked back. And some people don't realize that Robbie Krieger actually wrote Light My Fire. And it was not Jim Morrison who wrote those lyrics, but just a unique single because you got the Latin rhythm there. John Densmore, their drummer, was very much influenced by jazz drummers. Ray Manzarek was a big fan of jazz. Robbie Krieger had only been playing guitar for a few months when he joined the Doors. So it wasn't like he was this lifelong guitar player, but just his guitar playing is so essential to the sound of the Doors, as is Ray Manzarek's keyboard. In concert, Ray Manzarek would play bass. He would use the bass pedals on his organ to cover for the bass. But in the studio, on this album, they used Larry Knechtel, who was a member of the Wrecking Crew, one of the LA studio musicians. He actually played bass on this album, which gives it kind of a more organic sound. But I mean, so many fantastic tracks on here. You got blues rocker like Backdoor Man. You got psychedelic stuff like The End or End of the Night. You've got Alabama song Whiskey Bar, which is like a German dance hall kind of novelty type track. Soul Kitchen, Crystal Ship. Every single track on here is amazing. Most of it made it to classic rock radio, but such a dark, moody album when everything else was getting flowery and poppy. And then you have the Doors talking about, crossing over after death to the other side. Jim Morrison talks about, the end being his only friend. And in interviews, he would say, well, in death, there's no pain. So, of course, it's not something that he was afraid of. But yeah, just a great. And I know Jim Morrison never liked the fact that his face was blown up on this album cover and the other band was kind of shrunken here, because he wanted it to be very much a band. He was not an egocentric singer. He wanted it to be a group effort. And he got very annoyed when the record company would put his face very large on their covers, and then the other Doors are very small. Even on the Doors' greatest hits, a lot of their greatest hits compilations over the years, you've only had Jim Morrison on the cover. The Doors have either been on the back cover or not at all, because he's been the face of that band. But it really undersells the contributions of the other members of the Doors, because it's every bit their album as it is Jim Morrison showcase.
I didn't know that about the Columbia Records thing, but that just got me thinking about something. Was Elektra Records a new label around this time? Because I can't recall anything on Elektra Records prior to this, except maybe Iggy and the Stooges, which I think was around the same time. They were a relatively new label, because you had Columbia and you had Warner Brothers, and you had Atlantic, I think you had Mercury. But as far as major labels went, I think that was a relatively new label. And I think Elektra, it makes sense that the Doors were on Elektra, because they were a little edgier about who they would sign. I mean, years later, they took a chance and signed a band called Metallica, who a lot of people would say had no commercial potential whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's interesting. I did not know that. And boy, you talk about, like, speaking of a song that everybody knows that didn't chart very high. So first single hits, what you say, 125 was Break On Through, and then
126 on Billboard.
Has there ever been a time in history where there's been more of a difference between one single to the next? That might be a record. That might be a record. I don't even know how you figure songs below 100. I don't even know how they chart those.
Yeah, well, and Jose Feliciano did a cover of Light My Fire like shortly after the album came out. And I think that also, I think that the Light My Fire was #1 for 3 weeks, and then it kind of, sank down the charts. And then Jose Feliciano came out with his version, and then it rose back up to, I think it got back up to like 26 or something like that. So it had.
And that happened a lot in the 50s and 60s, when there'd be multiple versions of the same song right close to one another.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
All right, we're down to number one.
All right. Well, so this was a band that basically changed, got me listening seriously to music. And like Def Leppard, it was the third album that did it, and a lot of people went back and bought the first two, including myself. It's the first Bon Jovi record from 1984, self-titled, and again, kind of like the Doors, record company centered on John. The rest of the guys are on the back cover. And that happened a lot, right? Although years later, I don't think he had a problem with that. But anyway, this is a really good hard rock record from 1984, regardless of what people might think about Bon Jovi and what immediately comes to mind with them. Whether it's the stuff from Slippery When Wet in New Jersey, or whether it's the later, even more poppy stuff, this is a good, solid commercial hard rock record from 1984. Of course, the best known song on it is the first song, Runaway, which was actually recorded a little bit prior to the session that resulted in the rest of this album, because it's not the band playing on that. It's Roy Bittan from the E Street Band on keyboards, Tim Pierce, who is a well-known session player, he's on guitar. I think Frankie LaRocca is on drums. Oddly enough, Huey McDonald plays on bass, who's played bass on all the Bon Jovi stuff in the studio. And we didn't find out years later, it actually wasn't Alex Such. But so Runaway was a top 40 hit, got to number 39, and would become more known after they became bigger. The other song that was a hit of some sort off this was the song She Don't Know Me, which got to number 48. That's one of the few songs that they did that they didn't write, not even co-write. But you might be surprised, somebody listening to this going, why is he saying it's hard rock? You got to listen to Roulette and Breakout. Those are two pretty tough sounding songs for a Bon Jovi record. But I've just always been a big, big fan of this one. I bought it in 87 along with 1700 Fahrenheit. And both of those albums, I think, went on to triple platinum because they were just on such a run then. But I still think this album bears revisiting, a little bit like Def Leppard. Doesn't sound as much as what would come after it, although this does sound not so far removed from their later stuff. I actually think it's a slightly better record than 1700 Fahrenheit. It's definitely a harder record, and not the easiest one to find on vinyl unless you get a reissue. So that's my choice. That's probably the debut album I listened to the most, because the summer of 1987, pretty much all I listened to were the first three Bon Jovi albums.
Yeah, that's a real difficult album to find. I've never seen that one out in the wild. I mean, I barely see Slippery When Wet out there because I think people just aren't selling them. I mean, they know it's a great album. They know what they have, and they're holding on to it. But all right, my number one. And before I get into my number one, I just there were some honorable mentions that I didn't get into. I wanted to show Whitesnake's debut from 1987. I wanted to show Fleetwood Mac's debut album from 1976, their self-titled debut album. I wanted to show the Yes album, their debut from 1971. No, I know. Well, I just can't. I've done a video about this before where people think those are the debut albums, and I knew what you were doing. I knew. I just had to turn that screw because I get so many comments. I did a video on that, just like a tongue-in-cheek one, where I showed those, and I got so much hate mail in the comment section.
Seriously. I'm like, guys, if you watch Jeff's videos, he knows those aren't. Yeah. In all seriousness, though, I did think about the first Yes album. I did consider that one because Fragile is such a good album. I'm kidding. Yeah. No, but I did think about the debut from 1969, the self-titled, because that's a really good album. But that would have been like 11, 12, or 13 on my list.
Yeah, it would have been top 15.
How about that Heart debut from 1985?
Yeah, or Genesis's debut from 1983.
Def Leppard 2015. Metallica from 1991. Oh, so many. So Motley Crue from 1994. Yeah.
All right. Well, the real one I'm going to show, it came out on January 12th of 1969. Again, we talk about monster debut albums. You got to talk about this one, the debut from Led Zeppelin. This is my original copy. It's kind of got like the yellow font there and a little bit of a yellow tinge background. And then I've got the remaster from, I don't know, it was 2013 or something like that,
Yeah.
Which has got the red, a little bit darker on the background there. Got to show my cassette. And I got 3 CD copies. This is how much I love this album. This is the original CD release with the yellow. And then when they did the remasters. And then I've got this 2-disc set, which has got the bonus tracks with some live stuff that they did in 1969. But what some people don't realize about this album cover, oh, of course, it's the Hindenburg, but the person who designed this album cover, his name was George Hardy, I couldn't read my writing, sorry, Hardie. And he eventually worked for Hypnosis and also designed the album covers for Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here, Pink Floyd album. So I did not realize there was that connection.
No, I knew Zeppelin worked with Hypnosis too on like Presence and Into the Outdoor, but I didn't know it went way back because Hypnosis didn't even exist in 1969.
Right. He was just kind of a freelance art, whatever you want to call it, like art designer or graphic designer. But the producer on this was Jimmy Page, and he actually paid for the studio time out of his own pocket. Said it took him 36 hours, and he remembered because he had to pay the bill.
Yeah.
It was recorded at Olympic Studios in London. Glenn Johns, which some people know from the Get Back documentary that just aired, but he actually he did the engineering on this album, and he also mixed it. So he had a hand in that album. Glenn Johns, who also worked with The Who, and I think he might have done some with the Rolling Stones, but nonetheless.
He did the first couple of Eagles albums.
Yeah.
Brother to Andy Johns, another producer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he was a big name in record producing at that time. Another thing I didn't realize is this was one of the first albums to be released only in stereo. There's not a mono version of this album. But I mean, a classic from start to finish. Good Times, Bad Times, which, introduces you to John Bonham and just his amazing drumming. Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, which was a Joan Baez cover that they made their own. You Shook Me and Dazed and Confused were both great bluesy tracks. Your Time Is Gonna Come, which I think is such an underrated track. I love the organ at the beginning.
Church
John
organ.
Paul Jones. Sounds like you're in a cathedral. Black Mountainside, and I love that segue right into Communication Breakdown. And then it closes out with 2 more blues tracks, I Can't Quit You Baby, and the epic How Many More Times. But I mean, we just talked about Black Sabbath, but Led Zeppelin were every bit as responsible for, the future of hard rock and heavy metal.
I think Black Sabbath invented heavy metal, but I would say Led Zeppelin invented hard rock. The idea of it being a little bit more commercial and able to reach a wider audience. But yeah, if you listen to Dazed and Confused, that's doomy, and like that could have been a Sabbath song. And really that could have been a Sabbath. How Many More Times, that could have been a Sabbath song too, because that's not totally unlike like Children of the Grave or something like that.
Yeah.
But but what I can't even imagine, because rock music, there was nothing like it. There really wasn't anything like it to that point. Another thing about that album is that not only was it a stereo only release, but when they signed to Atlantic Records, I've read this, they became the first white UK act to actually be on the Atlantic label, as opposed to Atco. Atco was a subsidiary of Atlantic, and that's Cream was on Atco, and the Bee Gees, I think the Bee Gees were on Atco. But yeah, like usually rock bands that signed to Atlantic ended up on the Atco, but it's almost, but Jimmy Page and then Peter Grant, the man that, no, we want that red Atlantic logo because it was prestigious, right? So right off the bat, it was something special.
Yeah, the Rascals were actually the band from the 60s. They were actually the first white band that was ever signed to Atlantic Records. And then from there, I think they opened the floodgates for bands like, Led Zeppelin to be on the Atlantic label, because they had done like Aretha Franklin.
Yeah, Ray
was on Atlantic.
Charles. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, like, think about it. Atlanta, I mean, they eventually signed the Stones, Yes, Foreigner.
Mhm.
And they were a big label in the 80s. They had Rat and Skid Row and Twisted Sister. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of my favorite record labels as well, the actual label.
I love the red and green. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was a fun list to do. And I'm glad there wasn't any overlap, but we each could talk about each other's
Yeah, that's cool.
selections.
Not one. I was thinking there might be one or two overlap, but no, completely different.
Yep. Well, very cool. Well, Tim, I'm sure we'll look forward to seeing more of you on this channel, and I know we'll collaborate on other videos in the future. But make sure you check out Tim's channel, Tim's Vinyl Confessions, where Tim's got a lot of videos about the artists that he's just shown, and a lot of hard rock, heavy metal from 80s, 90s, even beyond. So make sure you check out and give Tim a sub. Thanks, everybody, for watching, and have a great weekend. All right. Well, I got albums, CDs, cassettes everywhere. Like,
I know. That's the one drawback, is putting everything away, but it's worth it. Yeah. No, this turned out well. Are you putting this up like soon?